So it's already 2 minutes past 5 o'clock. I'm sorry. So thank you that you wanted to join us and that you found a time slot for today's lecture. And today we've got an enormous pleasure and of course an honor just to host Claire Burridge. Claire is from the States, where she finished the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then they switched to England, where she studied in Cambridge for her MPhil and DPhil, and then he held a number of positions in different, say, universities, and now she's in Oslo doing her project, which is called Mini-Texts. She is a historian interested in medieval health and medicine, and as she writes, draws on a range of disciplines, bringing together textual, archaeological, and biocodicological evidence. As part of the Mini-Text project, she will be focusing on medical mini-texts, such as recipes added to manuscripts, otherwise unrelated to medicine. Her first book is entitled Carolingian Medical Knowledge and Praxis 775-900, New Approaches to Recipe Literature. And it's available in open access, so anyone that reach Claire's webpage can, of course, download the whole version of the book. So Claire, thank you for being with us. We are all hungry for help and for new information. And Claire, the audience, and of course, the screen of the computer is yours. So
thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you for hosting me. It's really been such an honor to participate in this year's Horizons of the Humanities lecture series. And I thank you also to everyone who's attending online. It's really nice to see some familiar faces, or at least names on screens. So thank you for taking the time to be here. So as my title suggests, I'll be speaking today about the transmission of dietary advice in the early Middle Ages. Given my background, I'll be focusing on the Latin West, and we'll be taking a deep dive into the manuscript evidence to consider the spread of medical knowledge through the prism of dietetics. In this talk, I'm also going to try to situate these sources in their time and place, and to think about, or perhaps grapple with, some of the paradoxes that emerge when considering the individuals involved in the transfer of medical knowledge, especially based on the few glimpses we have of more personal medical or dietary recommendations. And so on that note, I'll begin with a quotation. I'm going to read just a brief section of a letter that Pardulus, a bishop of Laon in the middle of the 9th century, sent to his superior, the Archbishop Hincmar. Pardulus writes, "You should abstain completely from everything which seems to be contrary to your ailment, namely from much fasting and from small fish, which you are accustomed to devour freely, and also from foods which are quite fresh, that is, fish which are taken from the water on the same day that they are to be eaten. Or if we're talking about fowl or four-footed animals, those which are consumed on the day they are slaughtered. It is necessary that these first be gutted and the humors carefully dried out with salt, and then afterwards he who desires health may eat them to his advantage. But never abstain from bacon or four-footed animals, for without these it will be difficult to reinvigorate your stomach. Besides this, one should abstain from everything which can be eaten raw, and even from celery, which you often eat, until it is quite certain that the Lord has restored your health. And one should then return to the dry, spare, and rather bland diet of the monks." So it appears that Hincmar was unwell, and according to Pardulus, needed to adjust his diet in order to regain his health. As we've just heard, Pardulus recommends various health-restoring foods, while also noting what to avoid, ranging from small fish and raw celery to fasting. We'll take another look at this letter later, but I wanted to open my talk with it today to set the scene because I, for one, have found it to be a somewhat surprising text for a number of reasons. First, doesn't it seem a bit strange that this Carolingian bishop was offering health advice to his superior, his archbishop? We might imagine that their letters were more often preoccupied with theological questions and doctrinal disputes, or perhaps the concerns of their flocks, rather than the alleged dangers of celery or the benefits of bacon. But at least this letter documents that such dietary issues were also open for discussion. Moreover, Pardulus's emphasis on regulating the diet as the means by which to recover one's health aligns with many medical writings that were circulating in the Latin West during this period, ranging from monthly health regimens to the text De observatione ciborum, a letter composed by the Byzantine physician and ambassador Anthimus for his Frankish host in the 6th century. Overall, Pardulus's display of medical knowledge suggests that he was quite well versed in contemporary medical ideas. But how did he acquire this information? And was his level of medical learning exceptional? And finally, isn't it a bit surprising that at the same time that the Carolingian world was so seemingly focused on standardizing the Benedictine Rule and mandating correct behavior at ecclesiastical institutions, Pardulus suggests that Hincmar should eat bacon and other four-footed animals, while simultaneously avoiding fasting and the simple diet of the monks. These recommendations seem totally at odds with the Benedictine Rule's dietary prohibitions, and this disjuncture raises yet another question. How did Pardulus, and presumably others in similar positions, negotiate the potentially conflicting traditions and expectations regarding diet that they encountered? That is, the rules of the Church versus the guidance provided by medical texts derived from classical and late antique sources. Do we see a division between the care of the soul and the care of the body? Or do letters like this one suggest that there were divisions between theory and practice? While it may be a bit too ambitious to explore all of these questions today, I hope that in the process of sharing some of my latest findings as part of the mini-text project at the University of Oslo, I'll be able to at least shed some light on the transmission and circulation of dietary advice in the early medieval Latin West. By centering my lecture on the manuscript evidence, I hope to demonstrate that medico-dietetic texts were perhaps more widely disseminated than has often been assumed. Ultimately, my findings suggest that it might not have been so exceptional, after all, for a bishop like Pardulus to have been plugged into the world of medical learning and thus able to share medical advice. Now, before I turn to the manuscripts, I should provide a brief introduction to the mini-text project, outlining the basis of the work I'll be presenting today. This ERC-funded project, led by Ildar Garabsanov, is investigating additions made to early medieval Latin manuscripts. Our team has now assessed about 98% of all surviving Latin manuscripts produced by the end of the 9th century, and we've been looking for textual additions that were made before the year 1000, and that, crucially, do not appear to relate to the manuscript's primary texts. This means that standard editions, like glosses and commentaries, do not count as mini-texts for the purposes of this project. I'm the medical specialist on the team, and this means that I'm examining things like recipes that were scrawled across flyleaves or jotted down on the margins and blank spaces of non-medical manuscripts, such as penitentials, collections of canon law, and so on. Subjects that have nothing, at least on the surface, to do with medicine. So on the screen, we have one such example. In the 10th century, a reader of Codex Semblensis 899, a 9th century poetry anthology composed at St. Gall, added 2 recipes from another manuscript, also held in St. Gall, to the second half of this page, making the most of the ruled lines that had been left blank when the original text was completed. So it might be hard to see on the slide, but this addition begins where the text begins to go a bit browner. So to sum up, the project's manuscript corpus contains essentially all Latin manuscripts produced before approximately the year 900, and the editions under investigation are those that were written, also in Latin, up to about the year 1000, meaning that they were often written within just a few generations of the manuscript's main text, and yet they do not appear to be directly related to that text. As such, they've often been ignored or sometimes even missed by past catalogers and remain largely overlooked and understudied. And if anyone has general questions about the project, I would be happy to say more in the discussion. But as for medical mini-texts more specifically, while recipes and incantations make up a lot of this material, our project has recorded the full spectrum of medical texts. In other words, essentially all the different genres of medical writing that you can find in massive medical compendia, you can also find as brief editions inserted into non-medical manuscripts. This includes short extracts from the Hippocratic Corpus, texts on bloodletting, treatises on urine analysis, various health-related prognostics, etc., etc. Within this mix, quite a number of our medical mini-texts relate to dietetics, the field of pre-modern medicine concerned with diet. Monthly regimens occur most often, and this is what I'll be concentrating on today. So with this background in mind, we're now going to get into the manuscripts, before then returning to some of my opening questions and prompts about the place of medical learning in the Carolingian world. Monthly regimens, an example of which you can see on the screen, so I've put it in brackets here, are guides to preventative healthcare that concern dietetics in the broadest sense and incorporate not only information about the foods and drinks that one should consume or avoid in each month, but sometimes also recommendations regarding bloodletting and other aspects of healthcare. Frank Dietrich Ronke has studied a Latin tradition of regimena, publishing a collection of editions and translations in the 1980s, in which he divided the known early medieval witnesses into a number of types and various subtypes. So the regimen on the screen belongs to Ronke's type 2A and is located in the middle of a 9th century manuscript today housed in St. Gall, Codex Anglensis 751. And this one represents a fairly typical example found within a medical compendium. So this one is not a mini-text then, but it's a more standard regimen, and I just wanted to share it to provide a baseline. In this case, it's then followed by another diet-centered treatise titled Observatione ciborum, which you can see at the bottom, the title appearing in the red. So we're looking at a discrete section on dietetics within this massive medical manuscript. For another example, we're going to turn to a late 9th century manuscript produced in northeast France and today held in Laon. While the codex is best known for its copy of Palladius's Opus Agriculturae or De Re Rustica, it also contains a relatively well-known cluster of regimens. 5 different variants appear near the end of this manuscript. And although this isn't a medical compendium, you can see how monthly regimena, with their emphasis on seasonality and the management of health, were fitting complements to the manuscript's main work. The 5 different variants are spread across folio 117 verso to 119 verso, and they're worth highlighting because they give a good sense of how much these texts can vary. So here we have the start of the regimen section on folio 117 verso, and the regimen that begins then continues onto the next page. And like the text I shared from Codex Anglensis 751, it represents another of Ronke's type 2A witnesses. But turning to the final page of this dietetic section, 119 verso, we see Ronke's type 7 in the top half of the folio. This regimen not only contains somewhat different dietetic information, but it also presents it in a considerably abbreviated format. Moreover, while many of Ronke's types comprise several witnesses, type 7 is only known through this regimen here. So it's really quite distinct, but we'll get back to that point in a few minutes. In the bottom half of the page, we can see one of Ronke's type 2B witnesses, a variant that takes a heavily abbreviated form and only provides the names of certain plants and spices that should be consumed as or in beverages for each month, rather than all of the other diet-associated information that you can see in the much longer type 2A. Now, about a decade ago, Klaus Dietrich Fischer published a really stellar article in which he identified several additional copies of regimena that were unknown to Ronke. He also noted that these texts often appear in spaces and contexts of a somewhat marginal nature, commenting that it's likely that we'll continue to find further examples of such texts if we look outside of the codicological environments in which we expect to find health advice. And just as Fischer predicted, By focusing on unexpected manuscript contexts, the mini-text project has now documented a number of previously unknown texts that belong to this tradition of monthly regimena. Some of the examples that I've been analyzing contain full 12-month cycles and relatively large amounts of text, not unlike the image on the left, whereas others include only a selection of months or very brief entries. So I'm going to share a brief highlight reel of what I've found so far, and then we'll take a closer look at the specific texts of 3 cases in comparison to the types identified by Gronke. Here, I should note that for anyone who attended my paper at this past year's Colloquia Carinea, some of my examples will look familiar, though we've also had some exciting findings since I shared my preliminary results in May, so don't worry, we will be getting into some of this juicy new material as well. Okay, in this first case, we're looking at the top half of the final page of a 9th century manuscript that mostly contains works by Augustine. This side of the folio was originally left blank, but in the 10th century, a scribe added a monthly regimen covering June through February. Next, this is just a snippet of a flyleaf from a late 9th century codex housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale that contains a diverse array of non-medical texts, such as the Life of Alexander. Multiple mini-texts were added to this flyleaf in the 10th century, including a brief selection of monthly health advice. So this one only contains recommendations for March and April. And one might wonder why such a brief section of a regimen was added, since for most of the year it really wouldn't have been much use. But one possibility, given that regimena often begin in March, aligning with earlier calendar precedents, is that this was in fact just the start of the text, and the scribe intended to add more, but then for whatever reason, didn't. Next up, in this mid-9th century miscellany that's also held in the Bibliothèque Nationale, various medical texts were added over several blank pages near the beginning of the codex, about a generation after it was produced. A monthly regimen falls right in the middle of the page. So I have a zoomed-in picture, but apologies, it's quite blurry. This regimen covers all 12 months, though the individual entries are quite abbreviated. Now, the mini-text that I'm currently most excited about is found in a manuscript now held in Orléans. It was produced at Fleury around the year 900 and contains works by Alcuin. A regimen was added in the upper and outer margins of pages 98 to 104 in the first half of the 10th century. So here you can just see the first 2 pages of this extensive regimen, though unfortunately you probably can't see much since the edition is now barely legible, perhaps due to the use of chemical reagents to try to read these margins a little bit better, but that didn't work out so well. So given how damaged these margins are, it's been a real challenge to work with this mini-text, but as I hope you'll see in a few minutes, it's also been well worth the effort. And for my last example in the highlight reel, in contrast to the lengthy regimen in the Orléans manuscript's margins, this one's very mini, maybe we could call it micro. We're looking at a selection of pages from a calendar that primarily lists martyrological content that's located in the final codicological unit of a composite manuscript now held in Zurich. Calendars are known to attract lots of additions, including those of a medical nature, such as notes about when Egyptian days fall each month. What's unusual here is that dietary advice has also been added. Now, this dietary advice is quite hard to spot because there's a lot going on these pages, and the dietetic additions are written in a fading brown ink. But I'll highlight them now. So here you can see that the words ginger and rhubarb were added in the margins of January, wormwood and fennel for May, and sage and savin for June. Without further context, these added words might look like fairly random insertions, but think back to the heavily simplified list of potions in the Laon manuscript. The additions to this calendar present the very same information, but in a calendrical arrangement rather than in a list format. Such a setting suggests that these monthly potions were understood to be practical, useful pieces of advice for maintaining health throughout the year. Technically, however, This last example isn't actually a mini-text according to our project's definition, because this particular codicological unit within the complex composite Zurich manuscript was probably produced in the 10th or 11th centuries. Nevertheless, I think the example remains highly relevant to today's discussion, illustrating the wide variety of contexts to which dietetic information was added in the early medieval West. So now that you've had a glimpse into the range of dietetic mini-texts that our project has been working on, we'll zoom in on 3 case studies. And this is the part that builds on my initial report at this year's colloquia and showcases how mini-texts are, on the one hand, complicating what we know about monthly regimen traditions that were circulating in the early medieval Latin West, but on the other hand, are productively expanding our corpus by bringing new variants to light. And as a heads up, there will be some text-heavy slides ahead because we'll be looking at the entries for a selection of months, and I'll highlight a series of different features, drawing out the relationships between my mini-text examples and several of Gronka's types. Although Gronka's texts are edited versions based on, in many cases, multiple manuscript witnesses, they still offer a very useful comparative framework. So to ease into the textual analysis, we'll stick with the additions made to the calendar, since these are very short texts and thus relatively easy to follow. Our calendrical mini-texts are highlighted in the gray column to the left, and I've compared these additions to 3 of Gronka's types. That's type 1, 2A, and 2B. For the sake of space, I've only included the months we've looked at in the manuscript, so that's January, May, and June, and likewise, this is why I've only shared Gronka's first 3 regimen types. Needless to say, there are many more comparisons that could be made. So the blue highlighter shows the parallels between the additions in the calendar and the 3 different selected regimena types. To review, for January, ginger and rhubarb were added to the calendar, and all 3 regimens. For May, wormwood and fennel were added, which we also see in all 3 regimens, though type 1 includes germander as well. And then for June, sage and savin were added, just like in the regimena, though types 2A and B specify that it's the flowers of these plants. The names of plants and spices appear to have been added to many of the months of the calendar, and then for those months where I haven't actually found them, I think it's possible that the text has simply faded, or perhaps they weren't added in those months. What's most important, however, is that when these herbal substances are found in the calendar, they consistently parallel the same plants named in regimena for the month in question. Let's now turn to the full 12-month, though heavily abbreviated regimen that appears in this Paris manuscript. Just as before, we're going to take a closer look at the information provided for January, May, and June. And now, in this table, we can see the mini-text entries for our selected months, again in the gray column, but now more in the middle, as well as the calendar mini-texts, which are to the left, plus Gronka's types 1, 2B, and then instead of 2A, I've included type 7 this time. And as a reminder, type 7 has some notable differences when compared to Gronka's other types that we've seen, and crucially, it's only known from the Laon manuscript that I shared near the beginning of this talk. So we'll break this down month by month. First, in January, the mini-text only includes rhubarb, not like the other examples we've seen, rhubarb and ginger, though type 7 includes neither. For May, things get a little bit more colorful. Our mini-text more or less parallels the beginning of type 1. It recommends not only wormwood and fennel, but also germander, highlighted in red, for restraining the humors, so highlighted in green. However, if we look at the individual words that appear in the texts, the mini-text uses the term funiculus for fennel, and this is also found in type 2B, unlike type 1 in the calendar, which use another word, maratrum. On the other hand, the end of the mini-text most closely parallels the type 7 text, in terms of both the spelling of germander and the specific word order. June then shows a similarly mixed picture. First, it's important to note that all texts, except for type 7, mention sage and savin. On the other hand, only the mini-text and type 7 include the plant Pislingua, or butcher's broom, which I've highlighted in the purple. And again, the phrasing of the final part of the mini-text looks much closer to that in type 7, which again represents the single manuscript witness. So looking at this overall, I think that this means that the information presented in our mini-text fits very well with the wider regimen tradition, though it doesn't align clearly with any one of Gronka's types. Indeed, what I find especially striking is that despite the fact that this mini-text's entries are quite short, they include information that's associated with several different branches of the regimen family. So just to emphasize this point, we'll think about June again. We see the two plants that feature regularly in many of the regimen types, sage and savin, but that are not mentioned in type 7, a text which instead lists butcher's broom, a plant that, as far as I know, has until now only been identified in this one regimen in the Laon manuscript. Yet in our Paris mini-text, we see butcher's broom alongside sage and savin. This example thus offers a useful reminder. These related regimens circulated very widely, and the surviving manuscripts only preserve individual snapshots. The incorporation of evidence from many textual regimens, even when incomplete or highly abbreviated, can help us to expand and update the types identified by Gronka, or even to reconsider his typologies altogether and focus more on the individual witnesses. And now for a final comparison, we're going to return to the Orléans manuscript. And this is the case that I'm particularly excited to share with you today, and that I haven't actually discussed before outside of the mini-text project, though I should say that my transcription is still a work in progress due to the margin's poor state of preservation, though I hope that I can update this after consulting UV images. And for this analysis, we're again going to focus on the entries for May, in the brackets to the left, June in the center, and January to the right. What I'd like to highlight from the start, and hopefully you can get a sense of this despite the poor preservation, is that the individual entries in this regimen are long, really long. So the entire left image here, that entire margin covers May. And the script in the margins is smaller than the main text on the page. So there really is quite a lot of content that's been packed in. And I want to emphasize the size of the regimen at this stage because the text in my tables won't look much, if any, longer than the text in Gronka's types, since there are still some gaps in my transcription marked with ellipses. If the mini-text were fully fleshed out, we certainly wouldn't have space to compare 3 months on a single slide. And so given the size of these entries, this time we'll just compare the mini-text, which is in the gray column to the left, to Gronka's types 1 and 2a, both of which present some of the longest entries per month when compared to the other regimen types. So in this case, I've continued to use blue, the light blue, to highlight the recommended herbal potions. Yellow indicates additional content that's shared by all 3 of these examples. Purple material is shared by the mini-text and type 1, whereas green is shared by the mini-text and type 2a. Starting here with January, you can see that all of these variants recommend the standard ginger and rhubarb combination, while sharing several additional points, including the recommendation to avoid bloodletting and to take an electuary. The mini-text also suggests drinking white wine on an empty stomach, information that is found in type 1, which you can see with the purple, but not in type 2a, though this one does open with the recommendation to drink 3 glupos of wine daily on an empty stomach. So it's similar, but it's far from a perfect parallel. On the other hand, several instructions immediately following this opening line of type 2a do offer a perfect parallel to the mini-text, matching the instructions found at its very beginning, and that's the text in green, though it's punctuated by some shared yellow instructions to avoid bloodletting. Where the mini-text and the type 2a entry mention a potion against suffocation, type 1 lists a potion against chills. Given our timing and the amount of text here, I won't go through each of these texts for each month in detail, but the key point is that we see a consistent pattern. So in May, the selected herbal potions appear in all 3 regimens, alongside a fair amount of additional shared material. Yet certain instructions are shared just by the mini-text in type 1, whereas other information is shared only by the mini-text in type 2a. And then, as you can see, the same also goes for June. In short, all three regimena have a great deal, and so that's just to recap all of them. All three have a great deal of overlapping information. And yet for each month, the mini-text only shares some features with type 1 and others with type 2. And since my transcriptions still have some gaps where I haven't been able to work out the text, I expect that there may be even more sections of overlap, as well as some content that probably doesn't align neatly with any of the information presented by the various types identified by Gronke. What is more, there is no clear patterning with respect to how the information is packaged. In other words, the monthly entries in the mini-text do not present a pattern with respect to how their structure relates to the texts of other variants, such as perhaps a uniform layer of shared material, then a layer of information only seen in one type or another, and so on, in a consistent order. Instead, as you can see here, the colors are all mixed. And this underscores the complex nature of this tradition and its transmission and transformation over time. Now, if we step back and take all of this together, it becomes evident that our mini-text is anything but mini, I would say. In fact, it appears to be among the most extensive early medieval Latin monthly regimens among the surviving witnesses to this broad tradition known at present. While more work is certainly needed to try to fill in the remaining holes in the transcription, it's already clear that this mini-text is highly significant. And it certainly illustrates that Gronke's types need to be reconsidered, or if nothing else, expanded. More broadly, the cases that I've shared today demonstrate that dietetic texts were circulating widely. And given that the mini-text project has already uncovered a number of previously unrecorded regimens in very unexpected manuscript contexts, it reminds us that the known surviving witnesses to this tradition probably represent just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what was once in circulation. And so on that note, I want to spend a bit more time thinking about their circulation and distribution in the early medieval Latin West, and how this can hopefully shed light on the study and perception of medicine in this period more broadly. Although a few leading Carolingian intellectuals have long been known to have had some familiarity with the medical art, just think of Walafrid Strabo and his wonderful poem Pardulus, a lovely piece on gardening that features many medical plants, medicine has not traditionally been seen as a field tied up with the wider social, cultural, and intellectual changes associated with the Carolingian world. The degree to which medicine stood apart from these developments has, of course, been challenged in recent years, and I think that medical mini-texts are one especially promising avenue for taking these challenges further. Our exploration of dietetic mini-texts, for example, has moved far beyond the well-known examples of these types of regimena and into uncharted territories. Yet by studying overlooked texts, not only are we bringing new variants of regimens to light, which is in itself, of course, very important, but we're also offering a new perspective on the extent to which information about dietetics and medicine was spread. And I would argue that this might be an even more important contribution. Just consider the diverse range of manuscript contexts in which the handful of examples I shared today appeared. Our mini-texts were added to codices containing works by Alcuin, texts on Alexander the Great, an Augustinian collection, and so on. Does that suggest that readers of these vast and varied texts, among many others, were also well-versed in dietetic thinking of the time? If nothing else, it shows that early medieval scribes who had access to these different genres of manuscripts had also acquired dietetic knowledge. That is, perhaps they weren't actively reading the manuscripts to which they were adding regimens, but were simply looking for any available writing spaces that they could find. While fundamental storage needs may, of course, have motivated some of these scribes to record their material in these non-medical manuscripts, if we look at a wider sample of medical mini-texts, we do have some counterexamples that strongly suggest that the individuals responsible for adding these texts were, in fact, actively reading the manuscript's primary texts and selecting these specific margins and flyleaves and other blank spaces as a result of their engagement with the content of this primary text. So consider, for example, a 9th century handbook for priests to which a number of different medical mini-texts were added. On a page in the middle of a penitential contained within this manuscript, a series of veterinary recipes were written in the margin. So here are just a few of them that I've highlighted. Now, this page of the penitential is where the section on penance for the sins of bestiality and other types of fornication begins. So I would say the addition of veterinary recipes seems anything but coincidental. Now, I raise this tangent because I think it illustrates that once we start digging deeper, we can sometimes uncover relationships between a manuscript's main text and the mini-texts that later readers added. And then even in cases where we as 21st century readers cannot see a relationship, we should at least be open to the possibility that there may have been connections. And I think this is important to bear in mind when considering the dizzying array of manuscripts to which medical mini-texts were added, and critically, the significant number of individuals involved in recording these mini-texts. And so this brings us back to Bishop Pardulus and his dietary advice. As we've already seen from his list of do's and don'ts that I shared at the beginning of this talk, it seems clear that he had acquired some level of medical learning. Following those instructions that I shared earlier, Pardulus also includes a simple recipe for what sounds a bit like a nice bean stew. He writes, "Finally, when rising from table, one should take a measure of beans that have been thoroughly purged and cooked with very clear fat. Although according to the philosophers, this is said to dull the senses, it is nevertheless believed to evacuate and dry out phlegm. It stirs up the rest of the food, which is, as it were, sleeping, and it teaches it the way it should go, and not silently." I think it's worth pausing on this passage and reflecting on Pardulus's language, and not just because I really appreciate his allusion to the potentially audible side effects of eating too many beans. Much of his phrasing fits with the medical texts that were circulating at the time. So we see, for example, references to the humors, both generally and individually, such as his reference here to beans' alleged power to evacuate and dry out phlegm, or in one of his earlier comments that I shared about drying out the humors of freshly killed animals with salt. In this section, Pardulus also refers to the philosophers, and then later he states that one should not lack familiarity with what promotes health, the hygeia of the Greeks. All this points to his knowledge of contemporary medical traditions. Indeed, as the Bishop of Laon, this should perhaps come as no surprise. Already several decades ago, John Contraini convincingly argued that Laon was a notable center of medicine in the early Middle Ages, drawing attention to its surviving manuscripts, as well as its links with Carolingian intellectuals like Pardulus, who left traces of their medical knowledge. While Contraini revealed a network of Carolingian scholars who had some knowledge of medicine, which in addition to Pardulus includes figures like John Scotus Eriugena and Martin Hiberniensis, I think that many texts can allow us to go a few steps further. Although the names of only a handful of leading Carolingian intellectuals can be directly linked to texts that demonstrate their medical learning, our mini-texts show that there was a much larger group of people who were not only participating in the study of medicine, but who were actively involved in its transmission. And crucially, these were people who, like perhaps the priest who added the veterinary recipes in the margins of the penitential, these were people who we have not typically assumed were involved in the spread of medical knowledge. So I want to suggest that although Bishop Pardulus may have been an exceptional figure for a number of reasons, not least due to the way in which he left his mark in the written record, the fact that he seems to have been relatively well versed in some contemporary medical knowledge, and especially that of a dietetic nature, is not in itself exceptional. Rather, perhaps Pardulus is closer to the norm. Indeed, one wonders if he ever encountered medical mini-texts in the non-medical manuscripts he was reading, as it seems that he might have been a receptive audience. Or perhaps he himself was responsible for some medical mini-text. Might he have added recipes or even a regimen to any of the manuscripts under his watch at Laon? While there is no proof of such activities in his case, the overall picture painted by the surviving manuscript evidence indicates that some individuals were doing precisely this. So having considered this widespread dissemination of medical knowledge from the perspective of dietetics, I want to wrap up by reflecting on some of the big questions that I raised at the start and the context in which Pardulus was living. How should we square the dietary advice he offers to Hincmar with the rules of the Church and the guidance of Church Fathers? To review, Pardulus specifically recommends that Hincmar shouldn't fast, should avoid fish, but should consume four-footed animals. More specifically, he should never abstain from bacon or four-footed animals. His emphasis on bacon presents an interesting parallel to the popular 6th century letter on diet that I mentioned at the start of this talk, De observatione ciborum. Again, written by the Byzantine physician Anthimus, it blends together Greek, Latin, and Frankish dietary customs, and one of its most celebrated passages concentrates on bacon. Anthimus notes that the Franks not only have a habit of eating this food, but that they also use it as a remedy, even applying it topically. He writes, its effect is akin to that of a good medicine for their internal organs. And if they have any difficulties with their bowels or intestines, it cures them. It regulates the bowels, and what is so good for them, they are healthier than other people because of this food. Based on the number of surviving copies, we know that this treatise circulated fairly widely in the Carolingian period. So had Pardulus read this text? Regardless of whether he had or was drawing on a wider tradition of the healing powers of bacon, this advice seems considerably more appropriate for a lay audience. How would it have fared with members of the Church, and especially leading theologians like Archbishop Hincmar? Well, despite the Benedictine Rule's prohibition on the eating of flesh from four-footed animals, it must be remembered that its strict dietary regulations were relaxed for the ill and infirm. With that in mind, Pardulus's recommendations to eat meat, to avoid fasting, and then to return to the monastic diet only after Hincmar had recovered, does in fact align really quite nicely with the rule. So it seems that perhaps medical and spiritual guidance were not in conflict after all, and Pardulus's plan for Hincmar could work within both frameworks. And yet this is where we encounter another paradox. The approach advocated by Pardulus, that is, being gentle on the body by not fasting, and then encouraging recovery by providing more fortifying nourishment, an approach that probably sounds pretty reasonable to us today, this conflicts with much, or at least some, of the medical advice in circulation. Many recipes, for example, stipulate that the patient should be fasting when they receive their treatment. The drugs often needed to be ingested on an empty stomach. How would such instructions for fasting, likely derived from a pre-Christian source, have been understood in a monastic community, communities in which acts of asceticism were generally lauded? Moreover, when dietary advice appears within or alongside recipes, such as this example added to Codex Semquensis 752, there are often many more restrictions. In this case, the text records a list of the foods from which someone suffering from paralysis should abstain. It includes most bread, the flesh of cows, pigs, and goats, so there goes Pardulus's suggestion about bacon, all water birds, all scaly fish, most legumes, though lentils and fenugreek are named as exceptions, all raw vegetables, all mushrooms, all beverages that inebriate except for thin white wine, thin mead, and thin light beer, and so on. Overall, I am struck that the surviving medical texts present such a wide range of different ways to manipulate a person's diet in order to effect healing. On one end of the spectrum, for example, Anthimus and Pardulus are advocating for the medicinal qualities of bacon, whereas on the other end, many recipes and associated dietary guidelines are recommending fasting in conjunction with the avoidance of any number of foods and drinks. As we've seen, however, it seems that the Church could have supported approaches from either end of this spectrum, depending on what texts or traditions were being mobilized. So while the Benedictine Rule counsels a rather gentle recovery, the superhuman feats of ascetic hermits would have offered a very different model. Though, of course, this also raises questions about the relationship between spiritual and corporeal health. And I think that these are questions that must be saved for another paper. Ultimately, I think the spectrum of approaches that we've seen offers a window onto how people on the ground responded to the textual authorities they were reading and copying, how they engaged with and sometimes adapted this medical knowledge to suit their own needs and conditions. So was Pardulus actively selecting his advice for Hincmar based on texts with which he agreed, favoring the advice of, say, Anthimus over dietary prohibitions recorded in other texts? Further research into dietetics, mini-texts or otherwise, is certainly much needed. And I hope that my contribution today has, if nothing else, offered just a little food for thought in this direction. And so on that note, I just want to acknowledge all the support for the mini-text project, all the different funding bodies involved, and the team at the University of Oslo. And again, thank you to everyone here who's attending and to my wonderful hosts here in Lodz.
Only two of us can applaud. But this is thank you for the presentation, and as always, very, very interesting. And maybe there are some questions, and maybe there are some comments on what Claire has told us. I can see that. Oh no, there was somebody applauding, but maybe there is a commentary.
Can I try and ask a question? My sound's not very good.
We can hear you, Debbie.
Okay, great. It looks as if there's been quite a lot of different texts. So he says that philosophers think one thing, and then something is thought to be something else.
I spoke too soon, and we didn't quite get all of that. But I think the question was if Pardulus is saying that he's drawing from different authorities, or that there's some disagreement in the. I didn't get that sense in what I've read, but I should go back and actually check and see if it does suggest that, because I think. He's only sort of specifically naming that he's getting this from other sources, unnamed sources, in a few places, but that it's not necessarily conflicting with any of the other advice that he's offering, but just saying that it comes from more authoritative sources, I think.
Thank you. I think I'll give up trying to use my mic. We'll talk further some other time. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie.
Can I have a question? You mentioned, you didn't mention something like conditions, so the illness the bishop was down with.
Yeah, it's not mentioned.
Okay, but are you sure that he was just in the state of being like acutely inflicted with the illness, or was it his convalescence?
Oh,
because usually I would say that there is a sort of logic in medical advice, no matter whether it comes from the West or from the East. And that is the structure which is largely Hippocratic and then Galenic. Yeah. And one thing, there might be this link with, say, Frankish bacon, yeah?
Yeah.
As a cure, as a panaceum, so as all healed, of any kind. I'm not sure whether Anthimus believed in it. He acknowledged that the Frankish people loved it and they used it exactly for medicinal purposes. But it was basically, say, something like part of pork that was basically quite appreciated. And pork was appreciated and quite good because it was similar to, say, the human body. That means that for a person that was convalescing and needed something that we would say was very nourishing, and they would say as well. So pork was not bad. So something like, for instance, those small fish that were not very much nourishing, they could be like cooling. So they might pose a danger to the health of a convalescing people, and especially to the guy. So, in my opinion, this thing could be quite easily explained on the principles of ancient medicine for a man that has just finished being inflicted by it and convalescing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yes.
And may I have, if you allow me, have a look at the penultimate?
Yes. Any thoughts on celery? Would that also fit with a cooling? Because celery was specifically named as something to avoid.
Yeah, but this is the thing with vegetables.
Yeah.
And seeds were not that much, but I just remember something like Alexander of Tralles. So this is far away, however. You've got a cold with you had a cold illness, and you are not allowed to eat fish because they are cooling.
Okay.
You are not allowed to eat vegetables except for those ones that were hotter or warmer than regular ones, like, for instance, celery, as the celery was mentioned.
Yeah.
No, as the hottest, as the hotter one.
Interesting.
But basically, all the vegetables were cooling except something like, for instance, garlic, which was exception, or onions. But they were rather medicines than something like food. The penultimate slide, I think it shows something. Fibus cibis abstinere debant quem paralysin tangit. And I would say that it was a so-called melancholic illness. So it means that in the body there was disbalance and it was cold. And he should abstain from not all bread, but horde, what is it? Horde at
the azimuth, the unleavened,
pane hordeano. So barley bread.
Yes.
So barley bread, but it was barley bread, and barley was cooling.
Yes.
The same with azimo. So that means the unleavened bread.
Yes.
Was extremely hard to digest, and this, like what? Problems with digestions resulted in its further cooling and the cooling of the rest of the body, and it meant only aggravation of the illness, because in cold conditions you would have production of cold humors like black bile.
Right. Okay.
And the same you've got with here, except for porcina, but caprina, and all of them were very hard. So you've got like a list of things that are very hard to digest, which cause cooling of the organ of concoction, I mean the stomach, and thereby the whole body, and then only aggravate the illness, provided, I think, that it was the paralysis, resulted by, say, cooling of the body. So I would say this is something that goes, that follows way of thinking of Eastern, so Greek medicine, and it's competent from my point of view.
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
So this is a very short commentary.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Any other comments or questions?
I'd love to go through the whole letter from Pardulus with you, actually, and get your thoughts on the longer.
I would suggest this.
Yeah.
Because it depends on the illness, on the, moment. So before crisis, after crisis, in
Exactly, yeah.
convalescence time, and so on and so on and so on.
Okay.
So can I have a question? I mean, if this idea of Anthimus and his bacon is reasonable, just no. What is the connection between Pardulus and Anthimus? How on earth could he? There must have been something like a copy of this, yeah?
Right. Well, we do have a number of Carolingian copies that have survived. And so it seems that it would have been circulating. So whether there was a copy that he could have had access to, we don't know, but it does seem that that's not out of the realm of possibility.
It wasn't the subject of my interest, but I remember Professor Berg.
Karl de Roo.
Karl de Roo.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions and no more comments. So if not, so thank you, Claire, for this, for me, absolutely fascinating thing. This is, as your yesterday's, an eye-opener, because usually people tend not to include such small pieces of information because they omit them as something that's not applicable and not bearing on the main text. And this is a mistake. This is a mistake, and hopefully your mini-text project will bring results, which really, I don't know whether they just turn everything upside down, but they would definitely become a very serious, major contribution to what we know already. So thank you so much, and already, and hopefully you accept invitation to another edition, and we'll come and we'll have another fantastic conversation and another fantastic presentation of yours. Well, thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in online as well. Thank you.
So thank you and have a very good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.